But the question for the voluntary sector, community of professionals and services trying to support people who've come here from Hong Kong is to think about the experiences that people have been through before, during and after arriving here, and how those are affected by the fact that people are coming out of a situation of danger, of restrictions, constraints, and of political conflict, of oppression and persecution, and in many cases conflict on the streets with state bodies, for example. And so if we take a broad concept of people who've sought refuge, if we use the word refugee for this section of the session, to mean people who have looked for refuge, people who've had to leave or escape a dangerous situation from oppression, from abuse, then those experiences are often common with the experiences of people coming from Eritrea, from Iraq, from, you know, people facing forced marriage in other countries, for example, coming to the UK to find safety, to find security, to try and rebuild a life, often in the hope that they will eventually be able to go back to the country of origin, but in many cases, and we know this is the case with a lot of Hong Kongers, expecting to stay for good, or probably to stay for good. Excuse me. So I think one of the things in terms of the voluntary sector and needing and wanting to prepare is understanding the experience that the people who've come here to find a safe place, to find safety, have been through. And I'm going to ask you to think through a small exercise about what those experiences are like, of whether you're coming from Tigrinya, or you're coming from Congo, or whether you're coming from Iraq, whether you're coming from Hong Kong, those experiences of persecution, of oppression, those experiences of having to leave, of the transit, of arrival. I'm going to put a table up on the screen. That one through. Sorry, I'm going to skip back through these in a minute. Here's a table. I hope you can see that. Are you able to see that? It starts with experiences of seeking refuge. And I'm going to ask you to think through a couple of these and then feed back as a group. So this is about that experience. So when people have been for often many years in their original country, going through processes of adaptation, and drawing on the work of Paul de Cilia from Refugee Council, who's linked in with the Thrive team as well, what he describes the process of anticipation and adversity, before things get too serious, before things get to the point that people feel they really need to leave. Are you able to see that print? Is that too small for you on the screen? Bessie, is that readable?
Maybe if you zoom in a bit.
I could make it a little bit bigger.
Yeah, that's much better, thanks. That's great.
Right, okay. So that might, yes, there we are. So this is the sort of early stage, what Paul calls anticipation and adversity in the trauma-informed approach. But that process of adaptation that might go on for many years in somebody's country as they change their life, bring back their identity, alter how they act, start to be careful what they say, for example, where people start to survive. They may be resisting the sort of pressures that they're under. They may simply be tolerating them. They may be adapting their behavior to try not to keep out of trouble, to reduce the risk that they might face. They often start facing discrimination, persecution, and then danger and threat and oppression starts to build up. And throughout that process, people are coping, they're changing their lifestyles and their livelihoods. Their aspirations start to change. Rather than I'm going to be this, it's like, well, let's just see if I can get to college, first of all, and the plans for what might happen in the future, for example. In many cases, this does link into poverty and exclusion from social structures. This is a generic set of experiences. I'm trying to draw out the common experiences across those people who've come to the UK to seek refuge. And I'm going to ask you in a few minutes to think about these, and the question is, what might the impact be of those experiences on refugees, and I'm using the term widely, on refugees' well-being and mental health. The second sort of stage, and these aren't actual things that actually happen, this is just a discussion framework, obviously, is that process of departure, where people often will start to make a few temporary moves. So perhaps they leave one job and they go to another job which is not quite so exposed, or they move from one flat to a flat that's in a slightly safe, an area they feel is slightly safer. But at some point there may well be a trigger, a crisis, and for example the events of 2019 and onwards, the violence on the streets of Hong Kong was certainly part of that picture. Plus an opportunity comes up, in this case the BNO visa scheme, and at that point people start to decide, they start to make that decision: we're going to leave, we're going to depart, we're going to cross borders, we're going to go into the next phase, which I think, coming from Hong Kong, is not so much an issue. This is more something perhaps for people who are travelling overland. But even so, at this stage, this would be what in Paul's language he would call the survival. Now, by now, people are moving into the survival stage, and this is the point where trauma is starting often to play a factor in mental health, or at least the experiences they're having at this point are quite likely to affect their mental health in future, for example. Temporary moves, the triggers. And at this point also of departure, there's also a process of giving up a great deal in terms of family, friends, neighbourhood, financial security, education, career. It's a huge, huge issue. It's a form of loss, it's a form of bereavement. It can have impacts like bereavement, sorry. Transit, still very much in that survival stage, where people are going through these separations and dispersal, people going to Canada, people going to other places, and often into quite transient and temporary residence. Now, we're not talking refugee camps here, but we are probably talking people moving in, arriving in the UK, perhaps staying with somebody for a while, where they find a temporary flat, then they find another one. So lots of moves going on. People both losing and making new networks and connections. Somebody who may have been a distant friend of a friend suddenly becomes a very important contact. And of course, there's a lot of costs, charges involved at this stage. Costs of visas, costs of the NHS health surcharge, for example. And then the fourth of these steps, which I'd like you to think about for a few minutes, I'll give you a few minutes to think about this, that is where we are now, really, from that sort of application, arriving as a BNO person, or arriving as any refugee, arriving in Britain, up to that point where people get whatever security they obtain, whether it's indefinite leave or whether it's British nationality, for example. And at this point, you're having decisions, so that the decisions are still being made for you, but now they're being made by another government in another country. There's a loss of power over what's going to happen to your future. People become very cautious that they're not going to do anything that might lead to them being breaking the terms of their visa, or where they might, risk deportation or get into other problems, might cause long-term difficulties with applying for nationality. So, for example, the nationality you have to have be of good character. So people are very nervous and often become quite anxious and nervous at this point, that they must be seen to be of good character. All these things that mean people aren't just themselves, they're constantly waiting for other people to make decisions. They often feel they have to play a part, they have to do things they don't necessarily want to do because that's what the right thing is. And there's this sort of loss of individuality, this loss of power, a loss of a person's own sense of agency, where they no longer feel that they can really make their own decisions or take control of their own lives. And this, of course, can go on. This can go on for many, many years. And there continue to be costs and constraints. I mean, the BNO people don't have public funds, for example. And in addition, these questions about, do you belong? Can you feel you belong? Can you actually call a house a home? Is integration a realistic thing when you are actually so much waiting on other people and so constrained by the conditions that you're living within?